I want to welcome everyone this morning to the 2022 State of the Economy. I'm glad you could be here. I am Dan Heiser. I'm the Dean of the Donald J. Schneider School of Business and Economics here at St. Norbert College, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you. Two quick housekeeping events before we get started. Because of time constraints, it's unlikely we're going to be able to answer questions during the allotted time. However, we do want to hear what's on your mind. So there is a follow-up email survey, and we would like you to respond with any questions, and we'll get you a personalized answer going forward. One of the most frequently asked questions we get, though, I can answer right now, and that's whether there will be a video of this event made available. And the answer to that question is yes. When you get that follow-up email, you'll have an opportunity to link to a video of the event, or at least ask for one. I'm not sure if the link comes with or if you have to request it, but there'll be directions in that follow-up video. Now back to business. St. Norbert College has presented the State of Economy for the past 8 years. Each year this event has grown, and today we number over 100 attendees, with more than 50 businesses and organizations represented. So we're really pleased with the growth that we've seen. The event continues to flourish because it truly is a community event. Your feedback is taken seriously and has resulted in an expansion of our programs. This year we're actually featuring 4 of the Center for Business and Economic Analysis student fellows who are going to be presenting today. And they are providing deeper analysis covering policy, housing, inflation, and the labor force. The CBA launched 6.5 years ago and is primarily focused on providing students with research and project-based work related to the local, state, national, and global economies. In addition, the CBA offers fee-based and pro bono consulting services, including things like economic impact studies. The CBA is partnering with organizations like the New North and Wisconsin Department of Revenue to develop local economic analysis on industry topics relevant to our region. But primarily, the CBA work is first and foremost student-focused. Students apply, interview, and vie for a very limited number of fellowship positions. This year, we've had our biggest cohort ever, a very competitive selection process, appointing 9 student fellows to the CBA. Our growing cohort of exceptionally talented students would not be possible without the support of our center's investors, sponsors, and event attendees like yourselves. We are especially grateful for today's event sponsor, Amerilux. Headquartered right here in De Pere, Amerilux has long supported many initiatives across the campus, and we are grateful to them for making today's State of the Economy event possible. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kurt Voss, the CEO of Amerilux family of companies, to say a few words and introduce today's presenters. Kurt?
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. I just want to say that we at Amerilux feel blessed to be in a position to sponsor today's event. Actually, we also feel a sense of obligation given the impact that St. Norbert College and the Schneider School of Business and Economics has had and continues to have on our businesses. We have at last count 26 employees who have graduated from SNC, and some have earned certificates through the Center for Exceptional Leadership, and one is currently enrolled in the MBA program. And in addition, our team has been attending this presentation for years to gain knowledge on the economy to help us plan for the future. So today, one of our company culture statements comes to mind that I think defines this event. That is win-win. While we certainly didn't invent this concept, at Amerilux we believe that we live it in a unique way. We believe strongly that any relationship, personal, professional, if it's to be sustainable, must be a win for all parties involved. Now, on a business level, for us, that means that we are very intentional about achieving these win-wins with all of our stakeholders, including our customers, vendors, employees, and our community. So today, we all win. We're going to be exposed to information that will help us understand our present and guide our future. The students presenting will have had a great experience preparing for and presenting at this event and finding a tangible use for all their studies and hard work. And SNC will again be providing a learning opportunity for its students at the same time giving back to our community. So again, Amerilux is honored to be a part of it. So please join me in welcoming today's presenters, Marc Schaffer, economics professor and director for the Center of Business and Economic Analysis here at St. Norbert College, who in my mind epitomizes the kind of faculty member that exists here. Those of you that have been exposed to Marc, like I have, are very impressed with his work, and it's no wonder that we're also impressed with the students that emerge from this campus. And then our student presenters, Michael Schneider, Molly Fry, Lydia Brozick, and Will McCormick. So coming up, guys.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. You know, this is, I was talking to Amy Cunding, our Director of Business Engagement, and we realized this is the 8th year that we've done this. So this is sort of a thing we've been doing for a long time. We're really excited this has continued to grow. And it's been sort of a signature event for us here at the center. And Kurt, Amerilux, thank you guys so much for sponsoring this year. We're excited to have you guys be part of the event. So we have a little bit to talk about today. Of the years we've done this, this might probably be the most interesting time to be having this conversation. So there's a lot for us to cover. There's a lot of ground we got to go into, and we're fortunate I have 4 very talented, very impressive students. If you're looking for, not that there's a labor shortage or anything that we're going to talk about, but if you're looking for some talent, I know some people that I can hook you up with in that regard. I will take a recruiting compensation fee though, in case we're doing that. All right. So excited to be having this conversation today, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of ground to cover. So this year, unlike years past, I brought in more students. We're doing the full 4 students because there's so many different things for us to be digging into. But to sort of tee up our conversation, I want to put a little bit into perspective. And I want to share a quote I've been using in my, I've been doing a lot of work in data visualization lately in my data visualization class. And there's a quote I came across which says a lot about maybe the things that I read. My apologies because it's from the National Bureau of Standards in a book from 1939. But the quote says, "There is magic in graphs. The profile of a curve reveals in a flash a whole situation, the life history of an epidemic, a panic, an era of prosperity. The curve informs the mind, awakens the imagination. It convinces." And the reason I'm starting out the conversation with this is, you know, the theme throughout the entire presentation is obviously there's been a pandemic, there's been COVID. And we can look at the graph that we see and the movements and the lines, but the reality is people are making decisions on where they're spending money, how they're spending their money. Firms are making decisions about what they're doing based on the movements and what this line is doing. So that even the timing of this line, when certain things happen with the Omicron spike, you're seeing things in the economy reacting and moving to what this line is doing. So I want to start off by sort of priming this with, we have the pandemic thing that has occurred, we have COVID that has occurred, and a lot of what we're going to see as we run through the topics that we're going to discuss today is how that has influenced the behavior of different segments of the economy. So specifically what we're going to talk about today, which is clearly a short list, talk about GDP, unemployment, inflation, the standard numbers to start out, which are obviously front and center right now in the news and media. Talk a little about from the policy angle, fiscal monetary policy, what's happening in that space, and then sort of run through financial markets, housing markets, how they're responding to expectations and uncertainty. And then, of course, the big topic, if you've turned on the news at all in the past couple of months here, is the inflation story. So talk a little about some of the things that are weighing on inflation and some of those inflationary pressures. And we're going to have the students sort of run through that list. All right, so a lot to talk about. I'm going to tee up our first student. Michael Schneider is going to come up and dig into our initial headline economic numbers.
Thank you, Marc, for the wonderful introduction and kind of teeing this up for me. So as he said, I'm going to get started here kind of going over a broad overview of what's happening in the economy, looking at some GDP numbers and trends, then moving on to unemployment and some labor market conversations, and then finally capping off kind of the overview part, at least, with the big scary I word right now, and that's inflation, of course. So with GDP right here, we can see real GDP here graphed in green over the last 15 years. And then that yellow line there is kind of like a trend line. It's the real potential GDP, kind of a line that we try to, or we aspire to kind of keep real GDP around. So we can see here in the last 2 or 3 years, as the pandemic hit, we saw a huge drop in real GDP. And we can just kind of see the magnitude of that here. If you look back in 2008, obviously the magnitude of this is much bigger, but we've also seen a much quicker recovery. So if we dive a little deeper into looking just kind of at the past 2 to 3 years here, a lot of people are going to first look at those big swings right in the middle. I kind of want to draw your attention actually to the sides more though and look a little bit more at what was happening before this happened and what's happening now after. So we can see typically we're seeing 2 to 3% growth in GDP, and that's kind of what we hope for. But now after, as we try to kind of recover, we're seeing 4, 5, 6, nearly 7% increases in real GDP. And then kind of a big thing to note here is recently we're seeing a little bit of volatility. In Q3, we kind of returned back down to more of a modest growth that we're typically used to seeing. But then it hopped back up in Q4 in nearly 7%. So if we break this down a little bit, we can see the 4 different components of GDP. Consumption here in green, investments in yellow, government in red, and net exports kind of broken down here. And obviously right away you can see that consumption and investment are really what are driving a lot of these swings. So first focusing kind of on the consumption part, we can see that had a big role in the big swings initially when the pandemic had hit. And then as we continued through 2021, we continued to see that consumption continued to grow, kind of trying to bring us back to that real GDP number. But it's important to kind of look at what's happening within consumption as well. So we can break consumption down into durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Services here in yellow, we can see big hit when the pandemic happened, and that's not surprising, of course, because as lockdowns and shutdowns happen, the service industry is really what struggled. So then we can notice it kind of came back in Q3 of 2020, but it didn't shoot all the way back, so we can kind of see that trend over 2021 as we continue to see higher than normal growth in service consumption. So then if we go back to this graph, looking at the 4 different components, the other kind of big driver here in some of these GDP swings is investments, as we can see when the initial hit, but also now here in Q3 and Q4, we can see that it's kind of starting to show up again. So if we break that down, we can see that it's broken down into non-residential, residential, and inventory investments. And we can see that inventories was really hit big when the pandemic first started. And then we can see here in Q1 and Q2 as supply chain issues started coming up. Companies weren't able to kind of build up their inventories in Q1 and Q2. But now here in Q3 and Q4, as companies are starting to kind of anticipate that, we're getting this kind of bullwhip effect, which Lydia is going to go into later actually, explaining why we're seeing that increased amount in Q3 and Q4. So now I'm going to shift to the next topic of conversation here, unemployment and the labor market. First things first, we typically want to look at unemployment rates when we're talking about the labor market. And we can see here right away when the pandemic hit, huge skyrocket of unemployment, record highs. But as quickly as it went up, it came back down almost just as rapidly. We can see now here in December at the national rate, we're looking at 3.9% unemployment. And at the state level, we're looking at 2.8%, which is right around where we were pre-pandemic. Of course, though, as unemployment rates look great, that's not the whole conversation, though. So if we look, as you drive down the street, obviously you're seeing those "we're hiring" signs in just about every window. We can see here in 2021, openings have skyrocketed. And to get some context about that, we can put this side by side with quits and layoffs as well. So as we see openings kind of skyrocket, we're also seeing quits have a similar trend, which isn't all that surprising. As there's more openings, companies are having to kind of compete for workers, so people are quitting and moving around in the labor market. But another interesting thing here to kind of note is the layoffs section. We can see kind of a straight line trend there. And then obviously as a recession hits, you're going to see a huge spike. And we return kind of back down to that level, but we're almost seeing kind of a decreasing trend there now, which is obviously interesting as we see openings and quits increasing. Companies aren't really able to afford to be laying people off at a typical rate. So a big part of this conversation is the drop in labor force participation. We can see that thin gray line when the pandemic hit, we were looking at around a little over 63% in the labor force participation rate. The pandemic hit, we dropped down nearly to 60%. It's come back a little bit, but obviously we haven't seen as nice of a recovery like GDP or unemployment, for example. So paired with the decrease in labor force participation rate, we're also seeing this aging population. So typically, at least in recent history, we've been seeing the working age population continue to increase. However, as of recently, as the baby boomer generation slowly fades out of the working age population and some of the younger generations are of a smaller population, we're actually starting to see a decreasing trend in the working age population. So this kind of paired with that lower labor force participation rate is causing this kind of inflated job openings that we're seeing. So then, to kind of wrap up this broad overview of what's happening in the economy right now, we can look at some of the new inflation numbers which just came out this last week. So here we can see a chart over the last 2 years looking at the annual percentage change in inflation. And we can see kind of at the beginning of January of 2020, the typical numbers that we're used to seeing for inflation, 2 to 3%. And then as the pandemic hit, we can see how those numbers adjust. And now here in 2021, we've kind of seen those take off in an upward direction. And now here in January of 2022, we've actually hit 7.5% for the annual percentage change in inflation. So to get some kind of context about that number, we can see that's actually the largest annual percentage change in nearly 40 years. In February of 1982 was actually the last time it was this high. And we can see over the past 40 years, we're typically used to seeing it kind of bounce around 2 to 4%. So obviously 7.5% is something very noteworthy. And just like GDP, we can kind of break this down and try and get an idea of what's driving this. So for all items, again, is 7.5%, but two of the big drivers here are food and energy. Food at 7% and energy at 27%. So obviously energy is really driving this right now. But another important number to look at here is all items less food and energy. A lot of economists like to look at this number because food and energy typically are pretty volatile. So this gives us kind of a better idea of what's happening across all items. And we can see that that's still pretty high at 6%. So then kind of the last thing before I pass the mic off here, this is just breaking it down into some even more subcategories, kind of driving in that idea that energy and food are really driving this right now. We can see at the top there, fuel, oil, gasoline, energy, commodities, all over 40% in annual percentage change. And then you see a lot of those food categories there toward the bottom between 6, 8, 10%. And then just kind of the last thing to note here is that outside of energy and food, which all these subcategories fall under, except for two areas, is used cars and trucks and new vehicles. So obviously as we continue to struggle with some of the supply chain issues in the auto industry, those prices have been pretty inflated recently as well. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Mark to talk about some of the policy implications that these have.
So when we met and we were talking about, here's the story of our presentation, who wants to cover what? I said to the students, I said, I'll cover what you guys want me to do. I walked away for 5 minutes, came back, and they were like, you're definitely doing policy. We're not touching that one. It was a very quick decision on their part. So talk a little about fiscal policy, a little about monetary policy. There's a lot to talk about here. We could do an hour lecture on each of these or an hour talk on each of these. So I'm going to kind of hit some of the heavy highlights, I think, that are important for context that we're trying to understand more about right now. So first, we're talking about fiscal policy. This is, of course, the government part of the conversation. So fiscal policy has been front and center in the news, all the spending happening by the government. But if you look at government spending based on what's included in GDP, and this is not to get in the weeds, but this is an important conversation. The graphs Michael was showing, it showed consumption, it showed investment, big swings, and government was there, but it didn't look like it was doing much. It was really, really tiny. If you look at the government spending piece, this is the variable that counts as part of GDP. Okay? If you look at this, it doesn't look like very much actually happened in the pandemic when you look at this measure. So the thing with the definition here is that the government spending piece that counts towards GDP excludes what we refer to as transfer payments. Transfer payments are any payments that the government actually makes for which no services are actually exchanged. So think about any Social Security money that goes out from the government. That's an expenditure, but there's nothing produced, so it doesn't get picked up in GDP. If you think about a lot of the programs that came out with the pandemic, stimulus payments, all those things that happened, nothing was produced, so there's nothing in the GDP component that's counted. What you want to compare that to, which is where perspective adds a lot of value here, is another variable called current expenditures by the government. When you drop this in, it looks like this, which tells a very different story of what's been happening. And for perspective, this whole thing is we're talking trillions here as we're talking about, so this is not an insignificant amount of money we're talking about. You can see the fiscal response by the government was significant here. You know, to the tune of several $1 trillion in terms of that response to help in the early stages of the pandemic to move us through in response to some of the lockdown situations that started early. So that's the first thing to sort of caveat this with. You got to pay attention to what these variables are telling us, what they mean and what they don't mean at the same time. So of course the question is, if we just spent that much money, you know, how did we pay for that spending? So here's a quick look at the deficit. So this is sort of the annual budget deficit per year. What we see is in 2021 and specifically 2020, we basically hit the largest deficits as a percentage of GDP since basically the World War II time. You see, you know, in 1943 we peaked at about negative 29.6% deficit, and you know, here in 2020 we're about negative 12%. So we're hitting high levels that we haven't seen in an extremely long time. All right, so if we zoom in a little bit just on this last section, let's just talk about kind of what we're seeing in more detail and what the current projections are. This is the same little stretch there basically since the 90s. I mean, deficits have been pretty normal for us in this country for a long period of time. And what we see, there's a brief surplus in the late 90s. There's some accounting things that made that happen. But we see right now we're at about negative 12.4% is our current deficit. Good news is, while this is large, a lot of this is tied to the large programs we rolled out for the pandemic response. A lot of those programs are pulling back and slowing down. There's other things that are talking moving past, the Build Back Better stuff, but a lot of that is timed over many years, not a one-year drop. So all that stuff that's in conversation right now is not really strongly reflected yet. The optimistic side, and I use that word in air quotes because this isn't necessarily the most exciting positive conversation, but the optimistic side is current projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan entity that's designed to analyze this stuff, is basically showing these getting a little bit smaller over the coming years, which is good news. But keep in mind, good news in that it's smaller, but not good news that we're still continuing to run deficits, which is kind of what we've been doing for a long time in this country. Now, just to give you a snapshot of what this looks like, here's the current estimates for the 2022 budget that went into effect in October of sort of where this money was going. So about $5.5 trillion was the size of the estimated budget for 2022. Some things I want to point out that they're important. When we talk about where does a lot of this money go, there are two areas in there that actually get a lot of, on a percentage basis, a majority of what we're talking about. Social Security and then Medicare and Medicaid. So those programs tied to sort of aging population, retirees, those are, just shy of half of what that spending goes to is those two categories, which is an important part. The other part that I think is worth highlighting and mentioning, and this is something to pay attention to over the coming years tied to the deficit and debt conversation, is the more we run deficits, the more that accumulates to debt, which we'll talk about in a second. And of course, the more debt you have, the more you have to pay in interest. So right now, estimated in 2022, about 6% of our budget, it's right there in the middle, net interest, about $306 billion is going to interest right now. So that's the variable to kind of watch over time. If our debt has increased, that means we have more interest burden coming in the future, which is something to pay attention to moving forward. There's a lot of projections on that. They're very much projections. The one part of it right now, the optimistic part, is that interest rates are really low, so we're paying a low amount on this. If rates start to rise, that creates more challenges because then you got to pay more on that debt, et cetera. Okay, so that's sort of some perspective of what we're looking like, but still the yellow box there shows the borrowing, still planning on a deficit again, of course, coming up here in 2022. So putting all this together though, what does it mean for the long term? What does it mean for our debt story? So this is sort of going way back basically, federal net debt as a percentage of GDP. Highest basically was in World War II time, as expected. And what we see is we're nearing those levels again here in the pandemic period. Current projections are showing this to continue to increase a little bit moving forward, up 4 or 5 percentage points in the next couple of years as this continues to roll out. Now, of course, the big question here is this a problem? And this is like an entire graduate course on the answer to that particular question, honestly. There's sort of the pros and cons to it. Obviously, the con I just hit on hard is the more debt we take on, the more burden we have to pay that back, which is the challenge that you got to manage over time. There's that huge part of the conversation. Not to mention the political part of the conversation. Anytime we want to do anything, there's a debate about the role of debt and how we respond to it. The it depends part is sort of the short run conversation to an extent, and the longer run conversation about what are the implications of taking on too much debt for a country. The problem for us in the United States, and I say this as a problem, is we actually are a unique country in that we are the reserve currency of the world. The Treasury is the gold standard of places where people invest. So we really have no playbook for what happens when a country like ours takes on a lot of debt. We don't know what happens. We know what happens when there's smaller countries that do this, that aren't reserve currencies, that also don't have the gold standard debt, and they can get into trouble. The U.S. has really not had any significant trouble, even as we continue to take on more debt. And for perspective, I just showed that we're hovering here at 102% debt to GDP ratio. We do have a bit of a canary down the coal mine. There is an extremely developed country that has been running at 220% debt to GDP for a very long time, north of 100 for a very long time. And that's Japan. They've been doing it literally for 15, 20 years, and financial markets have never punished them in any way, shape, or form, which is the short-run part of the conversation that as long as we can continue to service the debt, we're fine in the short run here. The longer run conversation of those implications, I don't see anything in the near future of us losing the perception of being the gold standard, which is the positive we have, just given that we have a very developed country that's well beyond this limit, and they've been fine so far in terms of being punished in financial markets or anything for that regard. All right, but there's a lot more to unpack there, but that's just kind of my quick takeaway and sort of where we are in the fiscal policy perspective. All right, now monetary policy is equally as interesting right now for a whole number of reasons. But of course, the first thing we're talking about is the standard Federal Reserve response to market fluctuations or recessions and things like that. Is the playbook? Hey, let's lower the interest rate, which of course they did. Same thing they did back in 07, 08 financial crisis. You saw those rates started to come up. 16, 17, 18. Of course, drop back down was the first thing they did in response to the pandemic. Now, there's so many moving parts to this because the problem with this is only one policy tool the Federal Reserve has. And they lowered it to zero, but we still had the pandemic. They wanted to provide more support to the economy. So they did a lot of other stuff, right? And those of you that remember anything about sort of the Great Recession time period, one of the words that got thrown around a lot from the monetary policy circles in the news was this idea of quantitative easing. And quantitative easing is basically the same thing that they do to lower short-term rates, but they're buying up a bunch of different assets that are designed to kind of push down longer-term rates, because that's another lever the Fed can pull other than the short-term rate that they have. So what you can see here is I'm showing you essentially the response to the Great Recession. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the assets in particular, right? You can see, and this is in trillions. You can see it was pretty stable, early 2000s. What we see is when the sort of Great Recession started, financial markets had challenges. The Federal Reserve responded with these quantitative easing measures by buying up more stuff. Largely, they were buying a lot of long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. The idea was to help push down longer-term rates is what they were trying to do. All right, so you can see what's happened. Well, when we roll into our current situation, the Federal Reserve rolled out the exact same playbook again, bought slightly different things, but a lot of the same things. And what we see is their response from the asset side was to do the same thing again, but even more. All right. So the Federal Reserve basically did an uptick, bought about another, let's say $3-4 trillion worth of assets to help support the economy. Now you might be thinking, well, why are they doing this, right? Well, the whole idea is if they're buying these assets that are out there, they're injecting money into the economy. And the idea is injecting money in the economy should hopefully help fuel some financial markets, fuel credit markets, get spending to happen to help encourage that spending. That's the goal. That's the purpose of what they're doing. All right. So we see that they've done a lot of that in recent years. Now, why are they doing it? This is the long-term rate thing I was talking about. So what I'm showing you here is a snapshot of what economists and financial people will talk about as the yield curve. So this is basically showing different treasury rates over time and what the interest rates are. So I'm going back to 2013 to show you kind of around the last quantitative easing time where rates were. And what we see is by 2019, our yield curve had flattened a little bit. The longer-term rates, the 30-year rates, had come down a little bit. So think about fueling mortgage rates, right? Housing market, right? Those lower rates are actually good for fueling those markets. And what we see is when we jump to the pandemic time, the first thing that happened is there was this shock where the Fed basically tried to drop all the rates down a little bit to help support any borrowing that needed to occur. Now, what we're seeing now and why this is important, QE is trying to basically respond and do some of that. What we're seeing now is, with the conversations in the news right now, with the inflation Michael just talked about, what we're seeing is pressure on, hey, maybe it's time to start raising these rates again, right? So some of the things you heard the Fed say they're going to do is they've started to taper some of their spending. So they're not going to be buying as many of those assets to slow it down. So what they're doing over time, and this is basically from February 4th, you're seeing that longer end of the yield curve is starting to go up, right? They're basically starting to raise that rate slowly as a way to sort of hopefully react to some of that inflation. The thing they haven't done yet is lower that or raise that shorter term rate, which is what we're hearing in the news right now, that they're basically talking about, hey, possibly some rate changes coming here in the future. Okay. Now, the one part of the conversation that I can't ignore is anybody that took an economics class, a macroeconomics class, probably studied something called the quantitative theory of money, which something along the lines of, hey, if the Federal Reserve puts a bunch of money in the economy, won't that likely lead to inflation, right? That's the thing we talk about. That's been a theory we've been talking about for a very long time. All right, and this is interesting as someone that's a teacher. This is literally a report that just came out from the Federal Reserve. They send stuff to literally teachers about what you should be teaching in current policy moves. And basically the way that we've thought about policy and the way that they're doing what they've done, that story doesn't hold the same way that it did before. That story is basically tied to something we call the money multiplier. And the Fed literally just sent this out to teachers and said, RIP the money multiplier, because this isn't how policy is working at all right now and hasn't worked this way for a while. Now, let me explain the quick snapshot of why this is different and why the Fed is talking about this. So we said before that the Federal Reserve just bought like another $3 or $4 trillion of assets, right? So in a sense, they're buying assets that they now own, but the money's going into the economy. Where does it go? It goes to the banks, and the banks then take that and they get it further out into the economy. That's what they're trying to do. However, there's a piece of the story that has changed in the past 12 years that's extremely important. So I want to show you a picture of the reserves of depository institutions. So this is our banks, right? This is how much money banks are sitting and holding on reserve. Extra, just not putting to work, just sitting on reserve. And a lot of these are going to be held in sort of their bank accounts at the Federal Reserve. Now, if you look at this up to 2008, it looks like this is basically zero, because it frankly is near zero, and banks, any extra money they had, they were putting to work as fast as they could. One of the things that happened in the financial crisis is the Federal Reserve started offering to pay interest on any extra reserves they're holding, and they had policy reasons for doing that. But what you see here is there was this shock where suddenly they never held reserves, then they started holding reserves. So when the Federal Reserve did a bunch of the early quantitative easing, a lot of this was going to the banks, and they were sitting on some of it. Not all of it, but some of it. Now, the conversation about, well, where's the inflation coming from? Is it coming from the work of the Fed? Well, I just said the Fed threw, $3 or $4 trillion into the economy. Well, let's look what happened in 2020. There's a bunch of this still sitting in the banking sector that has not got out. The idea of, hey, increasing the amount of money in the economy leads to inflation hinges upon that money getting into the hands of people that they're effectively spending. Some of that definitely got in the hands of people, there's no question about that. But there's still a bunch that has not really fully got that far through the cycle, which is why they're basically saying RIP the money multiplier, which is where that effect is not as strong as maybe it used to be, which is sort of the conversation they're talking about in terms of a policy perspective. Okay, so what does that all mean when we put it together for what we're looking at for monetary policy? I think there's two things to think about moving forward. One, they've already said they're going to taper a little bit, so stop buying as much in the quantitative easing space as they did before. And of course, two, which is the headline thing you're hearing on the news, is what's the Fed going to do to rates this year, right? They've already come out and kind of alluded to there's probably some rate changes coming. I'm showing you, this is one of my favorite charts to show, comes from the Federal Reserve reports. This is from their one from December. This is essentially what each member of the FOMC, the Fed Board of Governors Committee, believes what interest rates are going to be at in certain periods of time. So each one of those is basically a vote of a member who makes the decision on what to do to rates. And what you're seeing here is for 2022, you're seeing it tick up. They're ticking up in the range. The bulk of it is between 0.75 and 1%. So that would be, if they're doing quarter point, which is what they've done the past couple of years, quarter point moves, that's 3 quarter point moves to get that happening in the interest rate space. So I covered a lot of ground here for fiscal monetary policy, and I'm telling you, I literally just scratched the surface. It doesn't seem like it, but I literally just scratched the surface. Key takeaway here is obviously we're taking a lot of debt. What happens with that and servicing the interest is going to be the big conversation in the coming decade or so in particular. And from the Fed world, they're doing things differently than they have before. And for the short-term thing in terms of interest rates, expect a couple of rate changes here coming in the near future. All right. So again, covered a lot of ground. But I'm going to pass it over to Molly now, and she's going to dig a little bit into some of the implications of the interest rate conversation for financial markets and the housing market.
Hello everyone, my name is Molly Fry. I'm a senior at St. Norbert. I'm a double major in economics and business finance with a minor in Spanish. I'm involved in way too many other things, so I won't dive into those. But today I'm going to be talking about the financial and housing markets. And so I'm going to begin this conversation with, what is everyone's least favorite thing? Well, in the world of economics, it is uncertainty. And this is a theme that we are seeing in both the housing and financial markets, but it's not necessarily alone. We are also seeing that expectations is at play as well. And so this quote does a wonderful job at really summing up what these markets are experiencing. So it's more about future expectations than current conditions. And so these are really going hand in hand, but what's at the core of both of uncertainty and expectations is these interest rates. We're expecting them, as Mark just alluded to rise sometime soon, but there's so much uncertainty in how much, when, how quickly, how fast. There's so many questions that come along with it. And expectations then are driving what will happen next. And so here is the US Economic Uncertainty Index from 2018 to 2022. And so what you're seeing here is naturally when the pandemic hit, people had no idea what was going to happen, so uncertainty rose. But you're seeing some peaks as we kind of started to trend down. Those peaks trended very well with COVID-19 as well, and we saw as the different variants hit and the economy really wasn't sure what was going to happen next, those naturally rose. But now, if I could point your attention to February here in 2022, we're seeing people are really uncertain of where the markets are going. And as I mentioned, that's really in what is going to happen to these interest rates, how is it going to affect our markets, how are people going to react? And so this is already starting to seep its way into the financial markets. And so this is the Chicago Board of Operations Volatility Index, also known as the VIX. And so this is from 2020 all the way until 2022. And in this index, the key point here is the higher the values and the volume, the more volatility there is. And you're seeing with this dotted line, we trended pretty close to an average for the last year. In 2021, we didn't see so much volatility, but now to start 2022, that is definitely on the rise. And these expectations and that uncertainty is starting to find its way into these financial markets. And as Mark just showed, this is a different version of the same graph, but with these interest rates, we've expected them to trend relatively low, and really that's where they've sat. So now as we move into what will happen next, here is a very, very simplified overview of how these interest rates impact both the financial and housing markets. And so we've actually been sitting on this top half, so we've seen low interest rates. This has really increased our market performance and our participation, and so we've been sitting there for a while, and that's where that graph there, we saw the interest rate remain relatively low, that reflects that. But now we're starting to shift into this bottom half, and we're expecting it, and a lot of people are uncertain about it. So as these interest rates increase, we'll most likely see some of that market participation fall off and the performance change. And so here is the S&P 500, the annualized returns, and we all actually saw they were really high during the pandemic. So because of those low interest rates, we saw that some of these financial markets were doing fairly well. Now, if I point your attention to the start of 2022, obviously the year is not over yet, but the start is not really reflecting what we've seen in the last few years with these low interest rates. And that really is attributed to a lot of that uncertainty and those expectations of consumers and investors. And so along with those interest rates and those high peaks you're seeing, there are other forces that are at play. So we're seeing that US tech companies really led the way. So think your Amazon, your Facebook, now Meta, some of those companies did really well during the pandemic. We also saw that preferred relative substitution to the stock market because we saw some lower return in the bond market, so a lot of people were shifting their participation to the stock market. And lastly, those stimulus checks actually provided an alternative source of investment for many people, and we often saw those who got the money or those who already had the money were putting it back into the stock market. So that's why we're seeing some of that really high participation. And now we've talked about where the stock market has been and what we're seeing in some of those financial markets. We're seeing this climb, so that reflects, but this is the NASDAQ at this point, and this really captures US tech companies. And it's important to look at this because, as I mentioned, a lot of those companies have really led the way. And so now, as we've seen this climb, we're starting to see it fall to the speculation. So this is just the last 6 months. But if you look at the start of 2022, those expectations, as I mentioned, are really seeping their way in because people aren't sure where these interest rates are going to go. Like I mentioned, how fast, how soon, how quickly, how it's going to impact them. And so Mark just did a brief overview of this, so I won't dive too deeply into it, but we're looking here that the Fed is trying to lower those long-run rates. And so this is also really important if we're thinking about how the financial markets work together here. And the next thing I'm going to dive into is the housing market, and this has probably been in one of your conversations in the last few months as my guess, just because there's so much happening here. But the story more here, where expectations is more the primary driver in the financial market, we're seeing uncertainty is really the primary thing in the housing market. And so we're seeing housing prices are continuing to rise. And so this is April of 2020 all the way into October of 2021, but this is the average sold home price in the US. And we're seeing a dramatic jump between April, the start of the pandemic, to where we are now. And so really the question for a lot of people becomes, well, how will housing prices change in the next year? Are we going to see a change? Are we going to see an increase at a decreasing rate? What will happen next? Well, consumers actually doubt that we're going to see a price decrease. So if we were to just ask anyone in this room today, this is a survey given out by Fannie Mae, a mortgage loan company, and what they actually said, that we have December of 2020 and then December of 2021. And in December of 2020, if you would have asked consumers, is it a good time to buy a house? They would have said, yeah. Over half would have been like, this is the time. And we probably saw a lot of people follow through with that because we saw such a peak in the housing market. But now, fast forward to a year later, December of 2021, almost 3/4 of these same consumers said, no, I do not want any part of this housing market. And it's really, they attributed it to the prices because the prices are so high. And so what's contributing these prices? Well, there's three main things that are really at play. And this first one is two that really work together. So we're seeing on the far side here that home sales in the US are really up. They're peaking, and that's definitely starting a climb. But at the same time, our home supply is falling. So our sales are climbing and the supply is falling, and it's not nearly enough to match what's needed. So we're seeing those prices increase. The second factor here, which you've probably heard a little bit about, is lumber prices are still trending extremely high. If you look here from the start of the pandemic, that peak all the way to the top peak on this graph, it's at 136% increase in the price of lumber. I'll say it again because that is just a huge number, 136% increase in the price of lumber. And even today, where we look at February of 2022 here, we still see the upward trajectory, and we're still sitting at a 45% increase in prices. So with the sales and the supply not matching each other, as well as lumber prices being so high because the supply of used homes is so low and people are turning to new construction, but it's still very expensive. Then the last thing that Mark briefly mentioned as well is mortgage rates. So mortgage rates have trended fairly low, and so we saw a lot of participation from people who wanted to enter the market, but when those rates are low, we often see prices go high. So when you put all three of these together, we're seeing that extreme price jump from the start of the pandemic to where we are now. And so one thing you're probably wondering, and a lot of people have started to talk about, is, well, how likely is a price reversal? How likely is a drop per se? If you ask quite a few people, they will tell you it's really not that likely because there's so much going on. And there's three primary reasons a lot of people are listing and a lot of experts in housing companies. One, interest rates are at historically low levels. So even if we're going to see them rise 1% or 2%, that's not going to change the fact that these rates and some of these mortgage rates that will be reflected will still trend fairly low. Second, there is a large group of people who are waiting to step into the market. They're just like those consumers said, they're like, this isn't a time to buy a house. There's a lot of first-time homebuyers who want to buy a house. So as soon as we see those prices drop, we're actually going to see a whole nother section of people step into the market and say, hey, I'd like a house, and it's going to drive that price right back up. And the last thing, as I mentioned, is supply is just so low, and the housing inventory really isn't sufficient to cause this drop. So with all of this, we're not likely going to see a housing price reversal, at least in the beginning of 2022. And the last thing I'll cover today is, this is fascinating. So as I mentioned, we might not be sure that the prices are, we're going to be sure that the prices won't reverse, but a lot of people are uncertain and there's still a lot of expectations about where prices are going. So what you're looking at here is a timeline. The far side is December of 2021 to February currently. And what this is what different housing groups that are well known in this industry, what they forecasted for price growth in 2022. And so at the beginning of December, Realtor came out and said, I think we're looking at about 2.9%. Zillow came out a few days later and said, I think we're looking much higher than that, about 11%. And the National Association of Realtors followed that and said, I think we're looking closer to the 30-year average of 5.3%, and they said, we're thinking 5.7%. So we saw it was all over the board in December as people tried to figure out where these prices are going. But now, Zillow has been the first to break the silence in early February here, and they said, we were totally off, or we're looking at 16.4%. So as I mentioned, those sales, supply, the lumber prices, the mortgage rates, all of that is still very much causing strong prices to occur in the economy. And Zillow is just the first to say, hey, we weren't sure, here's some more uncertainty, this is what we're thinking now. And so, as I mentioned, the two big themes here is the uncertainty that exists in the housing market and where we're going, and then the other theme is the expectations in the financial market and starting to see those seep in. And at the core of that is really the interest rates. Really, how much will they increase, how fast, how soon, when, and all of that is driving where we are today. Now, I will pass it on to Lydia to talk about something that is also very hot in the news, inflation and some of the supply chain challenges.
Hi everyone, my name is Lydia Brozig, and I'm just going to be talking to you about some of the inflationary pressures that we've been seeing in the market now that we've kind of teed up where the economy is at. So we're going to be mainly talking about supply chain challenges, the energy markets, and the labor force, and how those things are issues in and of themselves, but particularly how they're driving inflation right now. So first is supply chain challenges, and specifically product shortages, transportation issues, and overheated consumer demand. So right off the bat, we're seeing product shortages tied to COVID-related production challenges are having those downstream impacts because as products are becoming more scarce, the prices are pushing upward. And we can see some of those subcategories of inflation of which subcategories are being impacted the most by those shortages and those price increases. So as Michael mentioned before, we're seeing the fuel oil, the used car market, and gasoline particularly. And that is in addition to the challenges associated with getting the goods downstream in the first place. So this graph here is an excellent example of dwell times for shipping containers at rail yards. We're seeing that as of February of 2021, the average dwell time was about 5.9 days versus September of this past year, which is now 9.8. So that is extra time. And when we're considering how long it takes for products to get to the shelf, any extra day is a day of lost profit for the business and potentially lost patronage as well. So now taking another look at the transportation side of things, while current delivery times for manufacturing goods are rising, the 6-month projection does look a bit more stable. So we're seeing in 2021, those yellow lines are rising, unfortunately. But for our projection, now in the green lines, those are going down towards the average a bit more, which is a bit more optimistic for us, of course. And although the transportation costs are still significantly elevated, we are expecting those to hopefully come down as well. So as we can see here in this graph is the Global Container Index, which measures the cost per slot for shippers to purchase freight space to get their goods along a specific trade route. So as we can see, last year was relatively stable, very low volatility, but this year is much more volatile at a much higher price level. This is a great indicator because it shows the supply-demand balance, considering that higher costs are associated with more cargo volume than there is available space, which is pushing up some input costs for businesses because now it costs more to get their products downstream. And this is actually bringing us into our next conversation about consumer demand, because this phenomena is largely driven by consumer demand because those suppliers are trying desperately to match that consumer demand that they're seeing. So switching entirely over to the consumer demand side of things, we can see that the third stimulus payment seems to have elevated consumption back to its pre-pandemic trajectory, indicating that we have that robust spending back. So if we all remember when the government issued stimulus checks in part to help reignite some of that economic activity when the economy was shut down at the beginning of the pandemic, the first two stimulus checks seem to have gone pretty much into our savings. We didn't really see a lot of spending there. But after the third one, we can see that consumption finally rose back to that pre-pandemic trajectory and has stayed there, which is the key part. However, now that we have all of that robust spending, we're seeing a new issue emerge, which is there seems to be about a 5% switch in consumer preferences from spending towards services to spending towards goods. So 5% doesn't really seem like that much, but when you consider that consumption is the largest sector of US GDP at about $16 trillion, that means that there is now $800 billion more of demand that was previously being spent towards services that is now being spent towards goods. So what we really need to do now is find a way to match that $800 billion demand, which is also in part fueling supply chain challenges because the things that we have in our inventory may not be what consumers are actually wanting to spend on. And now kind of circling back to the used car market, I wanted to use this example because this is an example of a market that is almost entirely driven by consumer demand for its inflationary pressure. So we can see that the prices rose from about 40.5% from 1 year ago, and we can see on the graph in the gray shaded region that significant increase. And as Mark mentioned before with policy, it's expected that the Fed is going to raise the federal funds rate, which means that consumers are more likely to want to purchase their goods now rather than waiting until later because they want to avoid those higher costs associated with waiting. And all of these elements could combine into something called the bullwhip effect in the economy, which is the demand distortion that travels upstream when there are disproportionately large order volumes in comparison to actual sales or actual demand. So the bullwhip effect always starts with some kind of inclination of increased demand. So in this case, we have robust spending and expectations of increased inflation. So what is the retailer going to do to respond to this? They're going to overorder to satisfy that expected demand and keep a little bit of safety stock because they don't want to lose out on profit by not having what the consumer wants. To follow that, the distributor is going to order even more to satisfy the retailer order and take advantage of any bulk discounts from the manufacturer. And then all the way upstream from the manufacturer end, they're going to need to order more raw materials to satisfy the enlarged orders because they're likely not going to have enough raw materials to fulfill that supply, which then induces some production delays and it's going to take even longer to get those goods back down to the consumer. So now that we know all of that, we can take another look at the Q4 investment of 2021 and how it was largely driven by inventories, which adds a little bit of perspective to interpreting our economic activity through GDP, because it's not actually all economic activity and recovery like we're really hoping. A lot of it is still driven by inventories. And like I said, even though we have all those inventories, it may not be what the consumers are actually wanting to spend on. And when we look at this graph, we can see in that yellow shaded region, it's almost cyclical. It's almost, we are seeing these massive inventories and they're dropping back down and coming back up and dropping back down. And it's because the supply chain is struggling to match the consumer demand and reach that supply-demand equilibrium that we'd like to be at. So now with all of that, our supply chain issues combined with overheated consumer demand, combined with already enlarged inventories, could lead to a more amplified bullwhip effect. What is that going to do? Well, it's going to cause more inflation and more supply chain issues. So on that positive note, we're going to move on to the energy markets. So as Michael mentioned before as well, we're seeing massive increases in the annual percent change in year-over-year inflation for the energy markets at around 27%, which I'm sure you all have noticed on your electric bills. So really, we're going to be looking at why is this? What is driving the energy markets to increase this much? And there's actually quite a few drivers, but for our purposes, I'm only going to focus on a few. So the main ones are that the changing consumer preferences have limited reserve exploration and growth for our fossil fuels in recent years, which has limited our supply. So we're actually at a low right now compared to where we're usually at in our reserves. So of course, because we have that limited supply, prices are going to push upward. And going hand in hand with that, our alternative energy sources are still too immature, and there isn't a whole lot of investment in them yet. To that, we can't provide a steady supply of energy from those sources, so we're still heavily reliant on those fossil fuels, which are in limited supply. Also, global oil and gas companies, they had to pay debt accrued over the pandemic before they were allowed to grow their production, which has increased their input costs and consequently their output prices to compensate for those increasing input costs. And then also, global demand for manufactured materials and fuel was restored a lot faster than global suppliers could increase their production, further decreasing the supply. So all of those things are putting upward pressure on prices, which is why we're seeing things like our gas, our electric bills, all of those things increasing faster than we can really keep up with. So just to look at a couple of examples, this graph here depicts our fuel prices for diesel and regular grade gas. They have been on the rise for the past year, but based on the projection for the U.S. Energy Information Association or Administration, they're expected to spike in 2022 and then steadily decrease through 2023. So the projection is there in that gray shaded region. So not really good for us in the short run because it still has yet to peak, but we're hopefully going to see them come down, which provides a little bit of optimism for us. And the same pattern is applicable to heating oil. And in this case, it's residential heating oil, which fuels our water heaters and furnaces in our homes. And we can see that, again, in the gray shaded region, we have yet to see it peak, but it's hopefully going to come back down for us. So end on a little bit of optimism there. So now I'm going to toss it over to Will so he can finish up the inflationary pressure conversation with how the labor market is impacting it.
So, hi everybody. My name's Will. I'm a senior here at St. Norbert. During my time here, I've worked towards a major in accounting, finance, and economics. So today we're going to talk about the labor market. This is a hot topic right now, and it's been seeing a lot of weird changes over time. So we're going to get into it. Starting here with a visual showing job losses and for any recession taking place in post-World War II. So we can see here that the majority see recovery from about 18 to 24 months, and the worst we've seen is near negative 3% job loss percentages. And right away I already lied to you guys because we're going to add 2 more recessions in here, and I'm sure you can guess what they are. First one is the '08 recession. We can see that the first thing that stands out is it's nearly 3 times the length of a, air quotes, normal recession. Also, at the time, it had at the time was the worst job loss percentages at nearly negative 6%. The next one to add in here is the Great Resignation, as they're calling it, the 2020 recession. So we can see that the '08 recession added the length, then the 2020 recession added the depth. So the 2020 recession sees a literal nosedive to negative 16% in job losses. And then after 5 months, it actually recovers to negative 6%, which is great to see, and we're actually starting to see it trend back towards that normal recovery time, but we're still sitting in that negative percentage right now. So that's just kind of teeing up what we're experiencing. So getting into what is the main problem here, as Michael had touched on earlier, unemployment is looking really good. In fact, in Brown County in particular, we're below where we were pre-pandemic, and the same with Wisconsin, we're below that same unemployment rate. But part of the reason why that's looking so good is we're actually seeing a labor force grow at a decreasing rate. And the main reason for that is we're seeing a lot of people leave the labor force. So we're seeing that not in labor force increase at a rate we have not seen before. So here we're looking at the number of individuals that are not in the labor force from 2006 up through 2022. We can see that there is that steady increase that we'd expect to see with the baby boomers and people just starting to leave the market. But at 2019, we see a massive jump. So from 2019 to 2020, there's a 7.7% growth in that time period. And then we've seen a little recovery following that time, but we're definitely at a point that we're higher than we would have been had there not been a pandemic. Getting into why the labor force is growing at a decreasing rate, we're actually seeing, so this is a visual provided by JP Morgan. And this is growth in working age population split up by those who are native born to the US and those who immigrate to work here. So we can see segmented into groups from 1980 to 1989, 90 to 99, 2000 to 2009, 2010 to 2019, and then the last group here is a projection. So from 1980 to 2009, we sit at about 1.1, 1.2% growth in the working age population. And then following that time, it significantly drops off, and we're expected to see that continue through 2029. So when we put this all together, we see a labor force participation rate that is decreasing. So this visual is from 2006 up through 2022, and again we can pick out that we see the decrease, so the steady decrease from 06 to 2020, which we expect to see, but then we also see in the segments men, women, and US, this massive nosedive, and they have not really recovered. The positive side, however, is that Wisconsin did experience some decrease, but it looks like we're actually sitting at a point we were pre-pandemic. And so this is just the zoomed in picture. We're looking at Q1 of 2018 through Q1 of 2022, and we actually pretty much recovered from where we were if we're looking at Wisconsin here. However, the men, women, and the US segments here that we're looking at are still sitting well below where we would have been pre-pandemic. So why are we seeing this trend of labor force participation steady? It's dropped off and it's not recovering. So listed here are just a few reasons of people that I've experienced in my personal life, kind of list off why they're deciding to not go back to work. So early retirement opportunity, I've had many family members tell me I'm taking that opportunity to leave because I don't want to deal with, like the second option here, health concerns. Childcare availability is a big one. As their kid gets sick, you have to take off work for 2 weeks. Sometimes a lot of people can't afford to do that and they're just either laid off or fired. Also, on the other side of things, people are realizing that they want a better work-life balance, and that also comes with flexibility in work from home. So the next thing we're going to get into here is a survey, actually 2 surveys done by Indeed.com, which is, for those of you who don't know, they are an online platform for employers to post job openings. So this was on a survey of 1,000 individuals, of which have voluntarily quit from 2 jobs from March of 2020, and they held their first job for over a year. So 90% of the participants emphasized that the pandemic made them believe that life is too short to stay in a job they weren't passionate about. So not only are we seeing the number of individuals in the labor force decrease, but we're also seeing this switch of attitude about where they're working, and individuals want to feel like they make a difference in where they work. So this is another survey we're looking at here. This one is based on 5,000 individuals, ages 18 to 64, and this has listed reasons why they're not urgently searching for work. And as you can see, I have the back half grayed out here, and that's because we're going to get into that in the next slide. But so what we're looking at here is June of 2021 through September of 2021. And so what they have listed here is they're able to choose what is the reason why they're not urgently searching for a job. So the top of their reason in June of 2021 is actually COVID fears. We can see that's followed by spousal employment, financial cushion, care responsibilities, and unemployment payment. A couple other things to pick out here. We also see unemployment payments start to decrease over time, and actually graded out in September because of the payments stopping in September. We also see COVID fears start to decrease over time, and that likely has to do to just general health. We're starting to see people get vaccinated and herd immunity start to become, Also, like I said, financial cushion and spousal employment. We can see that actually in January of 2022 is the leading reason why people aren't urgently searching. Financial cushion and spousal employment, it kind of pushes into payment. I want to get into the next slide here, but I want to read through the rest first. So, COVID fears we can see over time start to decrease through September and November actually is one of the bottom 2 reasons why people aren't urgently searching. And another interesting part is that in January, we're starting to see an uptick in the unemployment payments as being a reason why. And that likely has to do with Omicron variant. And we also see that with COVID start to increase in January. Okay, so tying the financial cushion and spousal employment, this is the wage growth tracker. So we can see here, this is from 1999 through 2022. And we can see that, just for reference, so you guys know, we're actually starting at 1.5%, so we're really looking at through a microscope here. But in 2022, we see this massive jump. And when we're tying that back to spousal employment and financial cushion, there's a story of people being like, well, hey, if I'm working, at this company and I can go over and get the same job for twice the pay or 10 grand more a year, why would I not do that? And so we're seeing this massive spike in wage. And that's something that's kind of start to build and build and build. And for a person like myself who's looking for a job post-college, this is great. I like this. For you guys that have businesses, this is terrible because employment is expensive. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mark to finish up the show. So, thank you.
I'm almost nervous to get up to finish this after following the students, so thank you guys very much. Quick round of applause again for our students here. So this is the part of the talk where I'm going to give you guys a quiz because you clearly were taking avid notes of everything we just talked about. I'm just kidding, that would be terrible. All right, but the key takeaways, there's so much happening, but I'm going to try to sort of boil this down to sort of 5 maybe points you can walk out with. All right, so the first thing is looking at some of our headline numbers. You know, the GDP numbers at the end of the year look pretty strong, 6.9%, which was really nice, a lot stronger than what we're used to having as our GDP's kind of recovered back to where it was almost from the GDP perspective in that measure. But of course, the underlying note there is a lot of this is inventory movement is driving a lot of what these high numbers are. We want to see the consumption sector really take a larger role in that perspective, which is something we're going to watch for in 2022, and we're hopeful that we can see. From an unemployment perspective, our numbers look really, really good. They're low, they're back to where they're pre-pandemic, but there's the little asterisk on that, and that is some of that is tied to the fact that we have less people in the labor force, which is why we have labor shortage, which that number's low because there's less people in the labor force is driving some of that behavior. So that's going to be an important thing is what does this labor force participation rate look like moving forward? Are we going to have workers rejoin the labor force? What is going to happen there? Because that's going to weigh, I think, on everything that we're talking about. Inflation, of course, is the hot topic. I think Lydia and Will did a good job of hitting some of these key things. The numbers are running hot right now, fueled by a bunch of different stuff. There's more money in the economy. There's supply chain challenges. There's energy market challenges putting pressure on this. There's the labor force challenges and wage growth putting pressure on this. All of this is putting us in the perspective of what do we do about this, right? So that gets to sort of the policy conversation, which is where this is the conversation the Federal Reserve is having right now. This is kind of part of their dual mandate. This is their job to look at this. And that is getting to what are we going to do about this? So you're seeing them start to taper a little bit right now with the quantitative easing we talked about and having conversations about putting pressure on those rates to rise in the near future, probably slowly, I would guess, at the beginning of year. And of course, it's going to have ramifications on the financial markets and the housing market to an extent. But we're seeing those ripple effects already play out in the expectations and uncertainty that we discussed. So policy is going to be the thing to watch here in the near future as well in terms of how they respond to this unique economic circumstance that we're living through right now. For that, I know we covered a tremendous amount of ground today, so I want to say thank you guys very much for coming. I want to say thank you to Amerilux, Kurt Voss, for sponsoring our event today. I also want to give a quick shout out. If you guys have not had the pleasure of meeting Amy Kundinger, she's our Director of Business Engagement at St. Norbert College. She works hand in hand in helping make this event possible. So quick round of applause for Amy, if you guys don't mind. And also, if you actually do want to get plugged in with St. Norbert, whether it's the CBA or any other way that you can hook up with the college, Amy is a good go-to person as our Director of Business Engagement. So please feel free to reach out to her if you want to get connected in any way, shape, or form. With that, we had so much to talk about. I don't want to do questions for everybody, but I'm happy to sort of hang out if anyone wants to talk about any specific questions they have. Happy to have the conversation. But one last time, I just want to give a quick round of applause to our students. Will, Lydia, Molly, Michael. And thank you guys very much. Have a great morning.